Dansikakio kitamskat nawa. Ernitzigason. Asniwachi was Skyganotinia. My name is Aaron. I greet you all. I'm from the Rocky Mountain House area. And I've been thinking about, I want to do some more videos on technology and language learning a little bit. And today I want to talk a little bit about why SRO, and not necessarily why you should use SRO, but maybe why you should know how to use SRO. A little more context. This video is probably most useful to you if you are an adult language learner whose first language is not Nihilwewin. I've been a student of the language for about 4 years, so the area that I'm most familiar with is around the Edmonton area in Amiskwaciwâskahikan. And so what I'm going to talk about here will mostly reflect that, but it does apply a little bit to different dialects and whatnot. Yeah, and so I guess the first thing I want to say is, as a disclaimer, I'm not a fluent speaker, just a language learner, and so I'll probably make mistakes, so go easy on me. And if you're a fluent speaker, I don't know if this video is going to make sense for you. If you're familiar with the sounds of the language, this video might not make sense for you, though maybe, it's hard to say. My experience as a language learner has been someone who doesn't have access to fluent speakers readily, and I spend a lot of time doing self-study and a lot of time in written materials, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. So before we could talk about why SRO, we should talk about what is SRO. So SRO gets its roots in a writing system developed by this fellow Leonard Bloomfield, who visited the Sweetgrass Reserve in the 20s and recorded 80-some stories that were later published into 2 volumes, the first of which is the Sacred Stories of the Sweetgrass Cree in 1930, and then the second, and probably more prominent, the Plains Cree Texts in 1934. Now, Bloomfield was probably the first one, I think, or to record or publish such a volume of works with like a standardized writing system. And so I'm guessing in the 70s, recognizing the need for like standard orthography in Cree, a group of elders and academics got together and they came up with SRO, largely based on Bloomfield's works. So Bloomfield's writing looked just like this, and from here to SRO is a pretty small leap. I think there were probably pretty minimal changes that had to happen, mostly converting a couple of different characters and getting rid of some H's, I guess. But if you can read SRO, then reading Bloomfield isn't too bad. So that's all fine and good. Why use it? Why use SRO, or why know how to use SRO? So first and foremost, the most ideal way to learn a language is obviously as a child in an immersion environment, growing up hearing the language, growing up hearing people converse in the language, being immersed in contextual scenarios that convey the language and its meaning. This is an ideal scenario. Unfortunately, as adult language learners, lots of people are disconnected from their communities. I know lots of second language learners that are disconnected from their communities, want to learn their language and don't know how to start, or having trouble. And so in my case in particular, just not knowing a lot of fluent speakers or not having ready access to fluent speakers, I've leaned a lot on written materials and self-study and anything I can find on the internet and courses and things like that. And even beyond that, when I do spend time around fluent speakers, I try to be as prepared as possible so that I can practice listening, so that I can practice speaking, so that I can hold a conversation, um, and not be stumbling over um, what I would consider, like simple things, I guess. And that's just me. I just want to be, I don't want to waste anybody's time. So I self-study a lot. Um, and so one of the things that SRO does is it standardizes the writing system so that when you write a word down, it's written the same way every time. Um, so one of the reasons standardization is important is specifically for reading. Um, to take an example of this out of that SRO book, the way we say this phrase, digichet, and the way we write it don't necessarily jive the same. If you spelled it out phonetically the way you might hear it said, gchet, gchet, jollychet, that's probably not going to look the same as the way that we write it out. And why is that? So it probably is not going to take you very long looking at the sentence to realize that this sentence is not that hard to read. And there's a reason for this. That's because we don't read based on the sounds of the letters. We read based on the shapes of the words. So if you look at that again, I'm not sounding out what this says, but I can tell at a glance that this says this sentence is not that hard to read. It's because my brain recognizes the shapes of all of these words and can infer the missing pieces in this picture. Furthermore, words convey meaning on their own. There's little bits of information locked in there in each of those words and what they are and what they do, and when they're put together, what they mean. And so we capture some of that when we write things down a certain way. So I'm kind of picking on this example. I pulled some of these off of Facebook. If you're a fluent speaker and you're trying to say I love you, or somebody says, on Facebook, how do I say I love you? Looking at all of these answers, if you understand the sounds of the language or you're a fluent speaker, all of these answers are technically correct. These are all technically the correct answer, but they're all spelt different. And so that's fine if you're just conveying something, or if you've agreed on a certain way that you're going to what sounds are going to make, what letters are going to make what sounds and whatnot. The problem with that is in English is probably one of the worst languages for consistency. English is actually writing wise, English is an awful language. Just here there are 12 different examples of how to make the sound E. And so SRO attempts to, and does a pretty good job of standardizing that. So if there's a sound E in a word, for the most part there's only one way to write that. Now, that's not technically true. There are a couple different ways to make that sound, but when it comes to inconsistencies in English and inconsistencies in SRO, English is way worse. SRO is actually, it's quite easy to learn, and once you get the hang of it, to use. So for that example, kasaget, and this is how we would write this in SRO. And there's a few things in here. This IHI cluster, kind of in the middle here, it doesn't always get, it kind of usually gets compressed when we write it. Kasaget is usually, but there's a reason that it's in there. The one is that this particular writing gives us a hint as to where the stress is on this word, and you don't necessarily always hear it that way, but lots of times you will. Kasaget. Another thing it does, like mentioned before, is we consistently capture some of that meaning when we write it down, so that when we look at this, we're reflecting those little bits of meaning if we know how to interpret that. Another thing that SRO does, or another thing that's beneficial from a standardized writing system is this particular word, itagamiksu, which means, to be busy with something. If you go, depending on where you might visit, you'll hear this word pronounced in different ways, even though it's the same word and it's the same language. For instance, this top example here, if you go to Goodfish Lake, or you might hear somebody in Goodfish Lake say, itahkamksin, itahkamksin. But if you go to Saddle Lake, you might hear itahkamiksin, itahkamiksin. And then if you go to Saskatchewan, you might hear itahkamikissin, itahkamikissin. So the stress is in different parts of the same word, but regardless of how you enunciate that word, in SRO, it's still going to be spelled the same way, which just makes it easier to recognize, find in the dictionary, that kind of stuff. Another benefit you get from SRO is if you know the Cree syllabic writing system, SRO is a one-to-one. So if you know syllabics, then you kind of already know SRO. Maybe not the details, but it works out the same. In fact, the entire star chart maps to SRO on a one-to-one basis. So you can convert to syllabics or to SRO, and there's no loss in there. Another thing they did when they put a SRO together, and SRO is still kind of evolving, I guess, but it's also dialect independence. So this example, Nitsigason, it's written the same no matter what dialect you're speaking in. The only thing that changes is the dialect specific part. So to TH you end up with Nitsigason, and dialect you end up with Nitsnigason. Yeah, so, and the thing I think why SRO is so important, and I'd flip over to my browser here, is there are so many resources. We really couldn't talk about SRO without talking about Frida Henneque, who's a Nihiwasqueo and a scholar who did a huge amount of work and published all these amazing books. Some of these are pretty advanced, but they're really worth a study. And the English is in there, the syllabics are in there. So if you know syllabics, you can read them. This book here in particular is a fantastic book. It's actually getting a little bit beyond some of the beginner stuff. It's still a bit advanced, but I've read through some of the other ones, and this one's a really good one. There's also, for beginners, this Matsunihiwiwin by Solomon Ratt, which is fantastic. He's also got one of these storybooks, the Woods Cree stories, again in SRO, syllabics, and then it's got the translation. Of course, the dictionary, which is all in SRO. Eric Wolvengray also released Otatsumunsa, Wawi Tatsumunsa, funny little stories. Also, there's a bunch of transcribed recordings, again in SRO and syllabics. 100 Days of Cree, also in SRO by Neil MacLeod, fantastic book. And then there's some that are coming up. Gaias Nuhtzin, these are coming up next year. There's also Cree Language of the Plains by Gino Kimasis, which are available free online. So if you want to just go download PDFs, and the audio is available with those, again, all in SRO. This isn't an exhaustive list, but if you understand the system, if you can work with SRO, then it opens up your world to a growing list of resources that are already out there. So some caveats, some barriers. Probably the number one thing when it comes to SRO is that the sounds of English and the sounds of the English letters are not the same as the sounds of Nihiwewin. And so a lot of people teach syllabics for this reason, so that students don't associate, when they see the letter T, they don't associate the sound of the English letter T with that letter. And so lots of people will teach syllabics for that reason. But regardless, if you're trying to use English sounds to represent Nehioewin, then I think there's the real possibility that you might struggle. Really, I mean, that was definitely my story, my experience. As soon as I realized that the Nehio sound system, when I was taking that class from Ruben Quinn in Edmonton at the Center for Race and Culture, and at some point it clicked in my brain. He was talking about how the sounds aren't the same, and Ruben spends a lot of time talking about the sounds, how to make the sounds, practicing the sounds, and it clicked for me. And as soon as I realized that, from that point on, when I started listening to fluent speakers and listening to audio recordings and watching videos and things like that, I could start to slowly hear the sounds that were being made, because my brain, I think, realized that where to place them, where they fit. Whereas the first time when I first started listening to Nehioewin in the beginning, or hearing fluent speakers, nothing registered, because the sounds aren't the same. In English, even if somebody's English is really poor when they speak, we can still pick up what they're saying if we're fluent speakers. But because the sounds of Nehioewin don't exist in the English language, then so much of it doesn't exist. I remember the first time I heard someone say "ta pue," and we would say, how do you spell that? How do you write that down? We would try to remember that, "ta pue," but we didn't know if we should write it with a T or a D, and the pue part if we should write it with a P or a B. We didn't know how to write it. So there's all this confusion about what letters do we use to remember how to say these things. And so SRO tries to help with that. But it's important to know that the sounds come first. The sounds of the language are so important. I'm going to pick on this example for a minute. And I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but I've heard people, beginners in particular, try to pronounce this using the English sound system. And I might hear something like "nitasi-kasan," "nitasi-kasan." And so, again, if we're looking at this word and we're saying, okay, let's practice using the Nehio sound system to pronounce this, and understand that it's just like if you're right-handed. I'm right-handed. If you're not right-handed, that's fine. If you're left-handed, this still works. If you're ambidextrous, just ignore this part. But try writing with your non-dominant hand. Grab a pen and try writing something down. When I do that, I mean, it looks like when I was learning to write when I was, 5 or 6 or something. It's all chicken scratch, and everything feels awkward. My arm feels awkward. Holding the pen feels awkward. Everything feels really awkward because I don't have any practice with that. Making the sounds of a different language is the same way. It's the same thing. The muscles in our mouth, our tongue, this is one of the most complex muscle groups in our whole body right here. And we use it to articulate sound. And when we're little, we're capable of producing all of those sounds just naturally, because that's how babies and little kids are. But when we get older, then our mouths kind of like fossilize around the sound system that we know, and it gets harder to change that without practice. And so that's the key. Practicing these other sounds, it's going to feel awkward at first. When I first started practicing the sounds that Ruben was prescribing, I felt like I was speaking gibberish, because my mouth felt so awkward. It was like me writing with my left hand. Everything felt so awkward because I was learning a different muscle memory. I was building new muscle habits, new muscle memory. And so that work's going to be required to get this down. So we look at this example again. What we have is "nitsigasun," "nitsigasun." Now there's actually this little glide in here, "yih," "nitsigasun," and sometimes it just gets smushed together, "nitsigasun," is the way you hear it in fluent speech. But some speakers you will hear very clearly nitsi, and you'll hear that extra syllable in there where that stress is. I threw this in there because we know that glide's in there because when you hear it in some regions, but also when you change this word in a different dialect, especially th and n, then the word is exactly the same except for that th and that n. So I don't speak th, but I'll give this a try. Nitstigasun, nitstigasun, which I hear our friend Kathy say, and then nitstigasun, which I hear I've heard some people say. I don't spend a lot of time around N dialect speakers, but I have heard that. And you'll see it written this way. I'm going to pick on this example, and it's kind of one of my favorites actually. So this word, apo, this means that one is sitting. That person is sitting down. He or she, that they sit. He or she sits, they sit. That's what this means. And so the temptation is, maybe a fluent speaker, somebody might say, well, that's not the way we write it. You would write it like this, apo, because that's the way it sounds. And I don't have a problem with that. As a learner, for me, it's problematic. I'm not going to tell anyone else what to do, but I will tell you why that's problematic for me. These are all different words that use that same word in there. So, ape, sit, ape, sit, nitapin, I sit, apo, that one sits. Iapia, we are sitting. Mamuapun, which is like a meeting, I guess, or a gathering. So the problem with this is all of these, if you try to pull, like, say, the root out of this, like, it's going to be spelled a little bit different every time. And so if all of our writing was like this, then it means that I have to rely on sounding this out correctly in order for that to register in my mind what word this might be. And we do that when we see the written language all the time. Sound things out and be like, oh, okay, I think that's the word that they mean. This person means this word or whatever. But that, for me as a language learner, that's an extra barrier, because I have to be sure now that I'm using the correct English sounds to represent the correct Cree sounds, and it's just an extra layer of complexity, an extra barrier. If we write this in SRO, then ape is in there no matter how you write this word, no matter where you see ape, for the most part, we're going to see the root in there. And so if I'm looking at mamuapun, I can see that ape is in there. I can see that piece is in there. Same as apo. And actually, this example here, to pick on this particular example, I know fluent speakers that pronounce the I in there and say apu, apu, iapiuak. I've only heard it a little bit, but I have heard it. So there are reasons that it's in there. And I'll probably do a video later on about like how W in Cree is not really a W, like the way we think about it in English, and like weak and strong vowels and things like that. But another time. Another thing that's problematic about saying, well, no, apo's not spelled that way, it's spelled this way, is that we're still using English sounds to represent the Nehio sound system. And back to that earlier point, we don't read based on the sounds of the letters. We read based on the shapes of the words. So the argument is very valid that, yeah, it doesn't sound that way. And again, I'm not going to tell anybody how to write anything, because it's, if you want to write it any way you want, it doesn't matter. But the reason SRO is the way it is so that the writing system is standardized. Some more resources. So if you're new to SRO, and I was just going to put a plug in for my friend here. Where's that other screen? Yeah, so Neil Redcrow, if you go look up YouTube Cree phrases SRO, and I think this is the video here. Neil's a fantastic language warrior and just a cool guy, and his Cree is like really solid. And he's got a bunch of videos here, and if you haven't seen these, then go through them. But he goes through some of the sounds of the language and pronouncing some of these phrases and stuff. So if you haven't seen those, definitely jump in there. Kathy, if you don't know Kathy Wiedenberg, who speaks TH, but mostly everything is the same. She has a Learn Cree with Me group on Facebook, also fantastic. Lots of resources there. Cree Warrior, this is Wayne Jackson, and there's some videos. Listen to the language. There's some fluent speaker interviews on here. If you're not listening to the language every day, I highly recommend you listen to the language every day. Listen to the language every day. Train your ear to hear those sounds, and then that little ball will start rolling. The snowball will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then over time new pieces start to make sense. And this one too, a shout out to the Alt Lab. So if you're familiar with the dictionary at all, or if you've used there's an old dictionary, the Orange Dictionary on our phones. Cree Online Dictionary has actually been kind of superseded, I guess, by this Wewena Dictionary. And same thing, SRO is all written in SRO. They've gone through and reworked Musqueam's Dictionary, I think the Albert Elder's Dictionary. Oh geez, there's another one there I'm forgetting about. All the dictionaries are in there, and they're all in SRO, so it's worth knowing. Final caveat: reading will only get you so far. I read lots of stuff, and I have pretty high degree of confidence in my pronunciation, probably most of the time, because there's patterns in the language, and certain things strung together usually always make the same sounds. But there's something internal. There's something about the context and the wiring in our brains and the way that works. For me, I know for sure anyway, if I don't hear a fluent speaker say a word or use a word, then I just inherently don't have confidence in how it's used, regardless if it's written or whatever. So it's so important. If we want to learn the language, if we want to speak the language, then we need to listen to fluent speakers. It could be a video recording, it could be in an audio recording, it could be somebody you know. Spend as much time listening to the language as possible. It's so important to train our ears, to train our way of thinking, to start hearing the sounds, regardless of how it's written. The sounds of the language are what is really important, and we can only get that from fluent speakers. So, thanks for hearing me out today, and once again, I greet you all, and have a great night.